Okay, so today's presentation is entitled Making the Most of Public Service Loan Forgiveness. I want to give you a quick agenda. First, we'll talk briefly about public service loan forgiveness under the original rules, its requirements, and the results. The results prompted the limited PSLF waiver. That's the temporary overhaul that Ina referred to in her opening remarks. If you're interested in public service loan forgiveness and applying through the limited waiver, we'll walk through the next steps to apply, and I'll close out with sharing some resources with you to find further information about applying and next steps. So first, let's just define public service loan forgiveness, known as PSLF. PSLF is a federal program that was designed to eliminate the remaining balance of a borrower's direct student loans after the borrower has worked in a public service career and made payments for 120 months. So we're talking about basically a minimum 10-year commitment of being employed in public service while having loans that were in repayment. So the way that these requirements of the program works, there are 5 of them, and they have to work together for a minimum of 120 months. So this image here, straight from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid, shows you how the requirements work together. So the first requirement is you have to have 120 qualifying payments. And again, these are under the original rules of PSLF. So you've got to have 120 qualifying payments. Those payments can only be made on direct loans. You also have to be enrolled in qualifying repayment plan at the time that you make all of those payments on direct loans only. The next requirement is that you have to be working for a qualifying employer in public service for that entire time. The 5th and final requirement is that you should still remain working for a qualifying public service employer at the time that you apply for public service loan forgiveness and at the time that your application is approved. So if all 5 of those requirements are met for that period of a minimum 120 months, then the goal is to have the remaining balance of your direct loans forgiven tax-free. So what happened with public service loan forgiveness? Many of you may have heard that the original public service loan forgiveness program had a really high rejection rate. Around 97 to 98% of borrowers who applied for PSLF had been rejected. The federal government created another program called TEPSLF, which is the temporary expanded version of PSLF. And unfortunately, that program had a similar high rejection rate in the mid to upper 90th percentile. But then last fall, on October the 6th, 2021, the Department of Education announced the creation of the limited PSLF waiver, and the waiver has really changed things for the better. Just to give you all some perspective, public service loan forgiveness went into effect in October 2007. That means that the first batch of borrowers could not apply for actual forgiveness until the fall of 2017. So between that time and October of 2021, 16,000 borrowers had their applications approved out of the more than 1 million who had applied. Once the waiver went into effect, between November of 2021 and June of 2022, 165,000 people have had their applications approved. So what we have seen is that after the implementation of this waiver, the number of approved borrowers has grown tenfold. So that shows us the waiver is definitely working. And that's why I want to get as many people into the pipeline as possible to access the benefit that you've likely earned. So this slide here shows you a comparison of the difference between public service loan forgiveness under the original rules, public service loan forgiveness under the temporary expanded version, and then public service loan forgiveness through the limited waiver. And just at a glance, you can see that we've gone from 5 requirements under the original rules down to 2 for the limited waiver. So I'll walk you through the differences between these 3 programs. Original PSLF, we've already seen, you've got to make 120 monthly payments on direct loans only, while enrolled in a qualifying repayment plan, while working for a qualifying employer, and while remaining with a qualifying employer at the time that your application is submitted and at the time you receive forgiveness. In the middle, we have temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness. You'll note that 4 of the 5 requirements remain. The only requirement that was stricken was that the borrower had to be enrolled in a qualifying repayment plan while they were making those 120 monthly payments. And as I mentioned before, similarly high rejection rates. So that little bit of lenience did not help much in terms of boosting the approval rate. Now, if we look at the far right, this is where we can see the big difference that has been made by the limited PSLF waiver. There were 5 requirements before, now we are down to 2. If you take a look at that first requirement, no longer does it say 120 monthly payments. It now says 120 periods of repayment. So the Department of Education and its servicer, they're not actually looking at payments that borrowers have made. They're looking at the status history of loans to see if the loans were actually in repayment. And we've also found in recent months that some deferments and some forbearances will count as qualifying months as well. So again, no longer looking at actual payments, but they're looking at the status history of the loans. The second requirement that remains, you can't get out of this one, is that you had to be working for a qualifying employer, because this is the public service loan forgiveness program. Without the public service, there is no forgiveness. So I just wanted to show you all in comparison how the original rules of PSLF stack up against the limited PSLF waiver. Now, the limited waiver was announced in October 2021. It was also announced as a temporary measure, and it is set to expire October 31st of 2022. So if you're going to take advantage of the benefits of these more relaxed rules, you need to make sure that you submit your application before October 31st of 2022. After that date, we're expecting that the original rules of PSLF will go back into effect. And we saw that the results from those original rules were not the greatest in terms of approval rates. So a little bit more about comparing the original version of PSLF to the limited waiver. Under the new rules, new temporary rules, any prior payment made will count as a qualifying payment, regardless of loan type, the repayment plan the borrower was enrolled in, or whether the payment was made in full or on time. And in some cases, regardless of whether a payment was made at all. Certain forbearances and deferments will be allowed to qualify as months toward the 120 necessary to achieve PSLF. The temporary changes will apply to borrowers who have direct loans now, those who have already consolidated into the direct loan program, and for those who choose to consolidate and make sure that they complete the application by October 31st of 2022. I want to pause for just a moment to talk a bit about Parent Plus loans. Unfortunately, if the only types of loans you have are Parent Plus loans, the limited PSLF waiver will not provide any additional relief for you. However, if you have student loans for yourself and Parent Plus loans that you've taken out for a child, then it's possible that the waiver could help you get all of that debt forgiven just a bit faster. So as for what the waiver has done, we saw how the number of approved borrowers has grown to 10 times the original amount. In Maryland, $320 million worth of federal student loan debt has been canceled tax-free for 4,700 Marylanders who are finally approved for public service loan forgiveness as of June 30th, 2022. It's really important for us to spread the word here in Maryland because Maryland ranks second highest in the nation for average student loan debt per borrower. Maryland is second only to Washington, D.C. So in this area, it's really important for us to get the word out about the waiver and have as many people get into the pipeline by applying before October 31st, 2022. So if you think you might be eligible, I want to walk you through this next steps to apply. And just keep in mind that if you're going to apply, you need to do it before October 31st of 2022. The other date that's relevant to public service loan forgiveness is October 1st of 2007. That's when the program went into effect. So your repayment history and your employment history will only be considered after that date of October 1st of 2007. So as of right now, we have almost 15 years of history to be considered for this program. And here are your next steps. Step 1 is to confirm your employer's eligibility. Public service loan forgiveness is based on having public service employment, and you have to verify that your employer qualifies before submitting a successful application. So first, you'll confirm your employer's eligibility, and you can use their tax ID or EIN number to confirm that the employer is indeed a qualifying organization. And we'll drill down on each of these steps in the slides that are coming up next. The second step Second step is you need to know your loans because the type of loan you have will determine whether you need to consolidate. And that's step 3, decision point. Do you need to consolidate? If you do need to consolidate, you want to make sure that you complete that application before October 31st of 2022. The fourth and final step is to document your employment through a process that's called certification. There is a PSLF application available on studentaid.gov. You will answer some questions about your employment, your status as an employee, and have that information verified by a representative of each employer. And again, you want to submit the applications by October 31st of 2022. So these are your 4 steps. Now we're going to zoom in on each of those individual steps just to give you a bit more of a detailed picture of what the application process looks like. So when it comes to confirming your employer's eligibility, you can log into your federal student aid account. That's at studentaid.gov, and you can go to the PSLF page. On that PSLF page, you're going to find a tool that I highly recommend. It's called the PSLF Help Tool. What the PSLF Help Tool allows you to do is answer a few questions online to populate a form that you can then download and print. The reason why I recommend the PSLF Help Tool is because if you download the paper application, you run the risk of checking the wrong box or failing to enter information such as your employment end date. If you use the Help Tool, it will not let you proceed without answering the questions. So you can drastically reduce the opportunity for error by using the Help Tool as opposed to printing and filling out the PSLF paper application. So within the Help Tool, the first part of the Help Tool is about checking your employer's status, and that's where you will need your employer's identification number. You can find that EIN on your W-2, or you could Google it as well. The W-2 is probably more accurate though. So once you enter that employer's EIN, you're going to get a result for the employer. The results range from eligible to likely ineligible, and no results. If your employer is eligible, that's what we want to see. And for those of you that work at MICA, MICA is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is a qualifying employer for public service loan forgiveness. So when you enter in MICA's EIN, you should see the result that the employer is indeed eligible for PSLF. If you have another employer and you enter their EIN and the result comes back as likely ineligible, that means that your employer is not recognized as a government agency or a 501c3 not-for-profit organization within the Department of Education's database. If you get this result, I want to encourage you to do a little bit more digging because there are some cases where there are other nonprofit organizations that perform qualifying services, and you might just need to provide some additional documentation to the Department of Education or their servicer so that they can evaluate the employer and make a determination as to whether the employer is eligible or completely ineligible. So if you do see likely ineligible as a result, it doesn't mean give up. It just means you might have some more work to do in order to make the case that they should be an eligible employer. Now, if your employer comes up as ineligible, then the Department of Education has already determined that the employer does not qualify for the purposes of PSLF. If the search yields no results, that means your employer is not in the database. It does not mean that you could not apply. It just means that you have to, again, submit more documentation to prove that the employer should qualify as an eligible organization for the purposes of PSLF. So let's move on to the second step. The second step is very important because the type of loans that you have will determine whether you need to consolidate in order for your loans to be considered for PSLF. Great thing about this is that you can do this part again by visiting studentaid.gov. You want to log into your federal student aid account and you're going to look at the My Aid dashboard. I want you to take it further though and go into details, and the screenshots that you see are actual screenshots of my loans from Morgan State University. So we get into the view detail screen, you're going to scroll all the way down to the loan breakdown. In the loan breakdown, you'll be able to see every individual loan you've ever taken out. but you have to go to the loan details in order to see the actual loan type. If you stop at the View Loans screen, you will not see the full name of the loan. So you need to go a step further, click on View Loan Details, and then you'll see that image on the far right. You'll see loan type and the full name of the loan. If your loan has the word direct in it, then it does not need to be consolidated. If your loan is not direct, another type of loan is a FFELP loan. Those are older student loans. If your loan is a FFELP loan, then that loan must be consolidated in order for it to be considered for public service loan forgiveness. So this step is critical because if you have the older variety of loans that are not direct and you submit a PSLF application anyway, the application will be rejected because FFELP loans don't qualify. But if you take those FFELP loans and consolidate them, they can then become eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So make sure that you know your loan types, and you can find that information at studentaid.gov. All right, step number 3, this is decision point. Do you need to consolidate? And once again, you can complete this process at studentaid.gov. I wanted to take a step back for a moment and talk about what consolidation means. Consolidation is when you take one or more existing loans and they're paid off. And a new loan, a new direct consolidation loan is originated for the exact same amount. If you have non-direct loans, then you're going to have to take them through the process of consolidation so that they can become direct and thus become eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So under the original rules of public service loan forgiveness, a person who had a lengthy repayment history could consolidate their loans and get them on track for PSLF, but none of their past repayment history would matter because the loans were not eligible. But under the limited waiver, things have changed, and they have changed for the better. Here's the language straight from the Office of Federal Student Aid. It says, your consolidation loan will be credited with at least the largest number of payments on the loans that were consolidated. So in layman's terms, that means that this new consolidation loan that you have will be credited with the repayment history of the oldest loan in your portfolio, provided that you had that qualifying employment. So let me walk you through this image so that maybe it becomes a bit more clear. We're looking at a borrower who has 2 loans here, a direct loan for $30,000 and a FFELP loan for $40,000. Those loans have different repayment histories. The direct loan is more recent. It has 50 months of history. The FFELP loan is older. It has 100 months of history. If this person takes these loans and consolidates them to gain credit through the limited PSLF waiver, the one new loan will be for the same amount as the sum of the individual loans, but the repayment history on that direct loan now jumps from 50 months to 100 months. So if you're a person who has FFELP loans and direct loans, you definitely want to consolidate the FFELP loans so that they become direct, but you might want to consolidate all of your loans so that they can get onto the same repayment clock. This is a huge benefit because, like I said, under the original rules of PSLF, if you consolidated your loans, your repayment clock would reset to 0. You'd have to work another 10 years, make another 10 years worth of payments to apply for that benefit of public service loan forgiveness. But now with a limited waiver, your past repayment history can be counted too. All right. Now, thankfully, the 4th step is much more simple. That is certifying your employment. The application to certify your employment is also at studentaid.gov/PSLF. You want to make sure that you certify your employment for any qualifying employer that you worked for after October 1st of 2007. And again, I highly recommend using the PSLF help tool instead of the paper version of the application. What you'll do is you'll answer a few questions using the help tool. After you've completed the form, the help tool will generate a PDF file for you. You can download that form, sign it, and submit it to your employer for their signature. And then after they give the form back to you, you would then submit that form to the Department of Education PSLF servicer, which is now a company called MOHELA. So like I said, the help tool is probably the easiest part. You've already verified your employment. You just want to put in the details of your employment, print that finalized form, have your employer verify that what you said is true, and then submit the signed form to the Department of Education servicer, which is MOHELA. And a little bit more about just certifying your employment. If you choose to do the paper application, which I highly recommend that you do not, but if you choose to do the paper application, this is what it will look like. And one question that I see that causes a lot of confusion with people is question number 10. The question is your employer tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code? A lot of people will check the yes. And if you check yes, then what you're supposed to do is ignore questions 11, 12, and 13 and skip to Section 4. A lot of people will check yes, and then they'll continue to answer questions 11, 12, and 13. You don't want to do that. You only want to put an answer to a question that applies to you. So if your employer is indeed a 501c3 tax exempt organization, you want to check that yes box and make sure that you follow the directions. Ignore questions 11 through 13 and move on to section number 4. So a few more application tips. The first one is to answer every applicable question. Only answer the questions that apply to you. If you use the PSLF help tool, the help tool will take care of that part for you. The second tip is to make sure that you include an end date. And if you're still working there, you want to make sure you check the still employed box. If you use the help tool, it will force you to do one of those. If you use the paper version, you've got to remember to either list an employment end date or check the still employed box. If you do not, then the servicer is going to send you back a note to say your application is missing information. You're going to have to submit another one. And we want to make sure that you're in the pipeline with a full, correct application before October 31st of 2022. Another tip is to follow the guidelines for acceptable signatures. Hand-drawn signatures are required, although digital signatures are acceptable. The digital signature still has to be hand-drawn though. So you'll need to you could use your fingertip, you can use a stylus. If you have an image of your signature, you could drop that in the form too. But the point is you can't just type your name in a fancy font and have that be acceptable. The requirement is that the signature must be hand-drawn. Next tip is after you've gone through all of this and submitted the PSLF application, you got to be prepared to be patient. It may take a few months for you to get a final qualifying payment count, and that's normal. So if it takes a while, do not be alarmed. But the key thing is to get all of your paperwork in before October 31st of 2022 so that your application can be evaluated under the more lenient rules of the limited PSLF waiver. Okay. So how do we get on track and stay on track for PSLF? The key here is to submit your PSLF application before October 31st of 2022. And this is regardless of where you stand on the number of years of work history and repayment history you have. You want to make sure that you get into the pipeline before October 31st of 2022. The PSLF program will still be around, but we're expecting that after this waiver expires, the older, more restrictive rules will go back into effect. So if you're a person that as of right now has 10 years of employment and repayment history or more, it's possible that once you submit the applications and consolidate if you need to, you could have the remainder of your debt canceled without any further payments. So if you have more than 10 years of employment and repayment history, I encourage you, please apply through this waiver as soon as possible. If you have less than 10 years of employment and or repayment history, it doesn't mean that the waiver cannot help you. I would encourage you to apply as well because the waiver can help you get credit for past payments that might have been deemed ineligible before for a variety of reasons. So regardless of how long your employment history or your repayment history is, if you've been working for a qualifying employer while you had loans that are in repayment, you should fill out the PSLF application just to see how close you are to that magic number of 120. Now, if you've already applied for PSLF and you're on track, you want to make sure that you stay on track. In order to remain on track, you need to stay working for a qualifying employer because the only months that count are months where you have the qualifying employment and that relevant loan repayment history. It's highly recommended that you submit the PSLF application to certify your employment every 12 months and or when you change jobs, provided that you're remaining in the field of public service. The last tip for staying on track, this applies to after repayment resumes. You want to make sure that you're enrolled in one of the qualifying repayment plans. The waiver has done away with that requirement that you had to be enrolled in one of the qualifying repayment plans. But once the waiver expires, we're expecting those old rules to go back into play. So once repayment resumes, you want to make sure that you're enrolled in one of the qualifying repayment plans so that you can stay on track for PSLF. Right. So I want to show you now what to expect after you've applied. The Department of Education and their servicer are going to evaluate your history, and you're going to see what's called a payment count. The payment count can be a bit confusing because there's some terms there that look as though they could almost be interchangeable. So what you see here is what a real payment count looks like. You've got the disbursement date, the loan program, then you have two columns there: PSLF eligible payments and then PSLF qualifying payments. The qualifying payments are the ones that are actually your tally of how close you are to the 120 that are necessary to achieve PSLF. So the qualifying payments are the ones that actually count. The eligible payments are the payments that you have made that were considered on time, in full, and while you were enrolled in a qualifying repayment plan. The difference between a payment that's eligible and a payment that qualifies is your employment certification. So for many of you, you might have eligible payments right now, but if your employment certification isn't up to date, then those payments aren't going to be designated as payments that qualify. That's why it's really important to submit that PSLF application to verify your employment so that we can convert as many of those eligible payments into qualifying payments as possible. So in the case of this borrower here, they had 137 eligible payments, but they only had 94 payments where their employment had been verified. The magic number is 120. So to get to 120 from 94, that means this person had 26 months left. So they needed to provide employment certification for at least 26 months. I'm happy to report that this borrower provided their employment certification and their debt has been cleared. So please make sure that you submit the PSLF application before October 31st of 2022 so you can get the maximum amount of credit toward PSLF and convert those eligible payments into qualifying payments. Okay, so I want to give you all some examples of what the difference looks like for real borrowers, the difference between the original rules of PSLF and the rules of a limited PSLF waiver. In this case, we have Mackenzie, who has worked for a qualifying employer for 6 years, made payments on direct loans under the extended fixed plan for 70 months. Now, under the original rules of PSLF, if we look at Mackenzie's loans, they're the right kinds of loans because they are direct. But if we look at the repayment plan, the extended fixed plan does not qualify for PSLF. So under the original rules of PSLF, Mackenzie would have to change her repayment plan, but none of those 70 past payments would qualify. She would get on track by working for another 10 years, making payments for another 10 years, and then applying again for the forgiveness. Under the limited waiver, all of those months, those past 70 months for Mackenzie would qualify because the requirement to be enrolled in a certain type of repayment plan no longer applies. That's only through this waiver. So Lindsay would start off with 70 qualifying payments, and she would want to make certain that she gets on track to make 50 more qualifying payments and get to that magic number of 120. So in this case, for Mackenzie has gotten 70 months closer to loan forgiveness because of this waiver, but only if she applies by submitting that application by October 31st of 2022. The next example I wanted to give you is for a person who is either retired or is not working for a qualifying employer. Prior to the limited waiver, if you'd retired, if you were only working part-time, or if you were working, let's say, in a for-profit career, then you could not apply successfully for PSLF because the fifth requirement was that you still had to be working for a qualifying employer at the time that you submitted your application and the time that it was approved. So I want to show you how much of a difference the waiver makes for people who are no longer working in public service. So here we have Jacob. Jacob worked for a qualifying employer for 22 years. He's been paying on FFEL loans under the extended fixed plan since 2005. So he's got about 204 months of payments. Now, under the original rules of PSLF, we look at that loan type. We know that FFELP loans do not qualify. Jacob could consolidate those FFELP loans into a direct loan, but he would then have to work for another 10 years and make payments for that entire time in order to be considered 10 years from now for public service loan forgiveness. And if he's retired, he probably doesn't want to go back to work for another 10 years. Under the limited PSLF waiver, Jacob would still have to consolidate. The reason is because Jacob has FFELP loans, and FFELP loans must be consolidated into a direct loan in order to gain eligibility for PSLF. So once Jacob consolidates those FFELP loans into a direct loan, he would then submit the PSLF application, and he would be given credit for all of the months that his loans were in a repayment status, also for certain forbearances and some deferments dating back to October 1st of 2007. So if you look at the picture on the right, under original PSLF, Jacob has no forgiveness coming at all, even after 22 years of public service and more than enough loan repayment history. But if you look at that top bar under the limited waiver, once Jacob consolidates and submits that PSLF application, he can get credit for all of those months of payment history dating back to October 1st of 2007, because he has the repayment history and he has the qualifying employment. So big potential benefit out here for retirees or people who have left nonprofit careers. The last example I wanted to show you is for someone who has an advanced degree. This particular example could also apply to a person who took a gap in finishing one degree. So it doesn't have to be about advanced degrees specifically, but just people who have loans that are on different repayment clocks. So in this case, we have Jen. Jen worked for a qualifying employer for 12 years. She has direct loans from undergrad with 96 months of repayment history. Her graduate loans have 64 months of repayment history, and she paid with an income-driven plan. So let's again take a look at this situation under the original PSLF rules versus under the waiver rules. Under the original rules of PSLF, Jen has two groups of loans. Some of them are 96 months into repayment, some are 64 months into repayment. With PSLF, the magic number is 120. So Jen would have to apply once for her undergraduate loans once they hit 120, and then again for the graduate school loans once they hit 120. So two applications, two different timeframes for forgiveness. Under the limited PSLF waiver, Jen can take her undergraduate loans and her graduate loans and consolidate them into one direct consolidation loan. Now that the loans have been consolidated, they will have one repayment clock, and that one repayment clock will match the repayment history of the oldest loan in the portfolio. So for Jen, that means that her graduate loans that were only 64 months into repayment have now jumped up ahead 32 months. Now all of her loans will be on the same repayment clock, and that's 96 payments out of the 120 needed for public service loan forgiveness. Now in this example, all of Jen's loans are direct loans, so she doesn't need to consolidate to gain eligibility for public service loan forgiveness. However, there's an advantage, because if she takes those loans that are on two different clocks and puts them together, all of the loans will be brought up to the same speed. The only other thing we need to make sure we remember here is that there was qualifying employment the whole time. The only months that count are months where you have both qualifying employment and the repayment history to match. So for Jen, if she wanted the maximum benefit of the limited PSLF waiver, she would consolidate those loans into a direct consolidation loan. Then after that consolidation loan originates, submit her PSLF application and complete both of those tasks by October 31st of 2022. So at this time, I have slides that go through the original requirements of PSLF one by one, but I do want to be mindful of your time and give you the opportunity to ask questions. So Ina, I want to ask you, is it okay to breeze through these original requirements very quickly, because these are the requirements that we're expecting to go back into effect after the waiver expires and then jump straight into Q&A?
I believe it should be fine. I think everybody is very interesting in all we're talking about, so we can probably stay over time if needed.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to breeze through these next 5 slides quickly. These are the rules that we expect to go back into effect after the limited waiver expires on October 31st. So again, that first requirement is you've got to have qualifying payments. You have to have a minimum of 120. I want to be very clear with you all about the point that these payments do not need to be consecutive. So if you worked for 3 different employers, that's okay. If you worked for one employer and then you took a break and went back to another employer, that's okay too. All it means is that the only payments that would not count are the payments that were made during months where you did not have qualifying employment. So you don't have to work for the same employer for 10 years straight for this program to work for you. You just get there faster if you have the 120 months of consecutive work experience. Quick note about the CARES Act forbearance. Those of us who have federal student loans, the majority of us have had our loans in a payment pause since March of 2020. If you have qualifying payment, then the months that are spent during this CARES Act forbearance are expected to count toward the 120 that you need for PSLF. So even though you haven't been making payments, if you have the qualifying employment, then those months should count. The second requirement is about qualifying loans. We went through this before. Direct loans qualify for PSLF. If a loan is not direct, it does not qualify, but it could be consolidated into the direct consolidation loan to gain eligibility. Parent Plus loans, again, are special. If all you have is Parent Plus loans and you wanted to get them on track for PSLF, you would need to consolidate them into a direct consolidation loan. So Parent Plus loans are a little bit special. If that's all you have, then that's what you need to do. The third requirement is qualifying repayment plans. All of the income-driven repayment plans qualify for PSLF, as well as the 10-year standard plan, although the income-driven plans are the ones that are most likely to leave you with a balance left to forgive after 10 years. Another quick note just for Parent Plus borrowers. The only income-driven plan that's available for Parent Plus borrowers at this time is called ICR. That's the Income Contingent Repayment Plan. So if all you have are Parent Plus loans, you'd have to consolidate them into a direct consolidation loan and then enroll in the Income Contingent Repayment Plan to get on track for public service loan forgiveness. Right, requirement number 4, this is about qualifying employment. I know I mentioned earlier today that if you work for MICA, MICA is a qualifying employer for the purposes of public service loan forgiveness. But if you're looking at other employers, just remember, it's about the entity that you work for, not what you do for that entity. So it's not about your job responsibilities or you're an accountant, so you can't get it. That's not true. It's about the type of organization that you work for. The types of organizations that qualify are government agencies at the federal, state, local, and tribal level, 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, also other nonprofit organizations that provide qualifying services. So there is a wide range of organizations that are qualifying employers for PSLF. PSLF also requires full-time employment. To meet the definition of full-time, you either need to work an average of 30 hours per week, at least 30 hours per week, or meet your employer's definition of full-time. So if you have multiple qualifying part-time jobs, you can put those together to meet the threshold of one full-time job. Also, employers have some flexibility when it comes to checking the box on whether you're full-time or part-time. But again, if you have multiple part-time jobs and all of the organizations are qualifying employers, you can lump those together to meet that threshold of full-time employment. The fifth and final requirement under the original rules of PSLF is that you still have to be working for a qualifying employer at the time that you submit your application and at the time that loan forgiveness is received. So under the original rules, if you had retired, if you had shifted to a for-profit career, or if you were only working part-time, then your application would be denied. But remember, under the waiver, this requirement has been waived. So if you're a retiree If you're now only working part-time, or if you shifted to a for-profit career, I'd still encourage you to fill out that PSLF application and just to see how near or far you are from the magic number of 120 qualifying payments. All right, and before we open it up for Q&A, I just wanted to share some resources with you. The first and foremost, studentaid.gov. The Department of Education, that's the source of your loan. So you want to make sure that you go straight to them for confirmation that your employer is eligible, verifying your loan types, using the PSLF help tool to complete the application, and also completing your application to consolidate if you must consolidate to get on track for PSLF. Quick note too, there's a difference between consolidating your loans with the federal government and refinancing them with a private lender. If you refinance your loans with a private lender, you will lose all eligibility for public service loan forgiveness. So the only application to consolidate federal student loans is located at studentaid.gov. Do not refinance your federal student loans through a private lender if you want to remain eligible for public service loan forgiveness. The second resource I'd like to share is an organization I started last year. It's called the Maryland Center for Collegiate Financial Wellness. We are really working hard to spread the word about this limited PSLF waiver, and we've dedicated an online resource page to that information. So you can visit us online at mccfw.org/MDTAPS. And MDTAP stands for Maryland Tell a Public Servant. The last two are excellent resources for PSLF as well. If you are interested in what borrowers are dealing with like real time as they're submitting the applications and hearing back from the Department of Education and their servicer, I really think you should check out Reddit in the PSLF mega thread. You'll get people who are posting, I've got 200,000 in debt. I submitted my application on April 1st. I heard back on June 30th, and they're giving you like step by step what the experience looks like. And I think that is very helpful to, take a look at communities like that and learn from them, because what you learn might help you navigate your experience a little bit more smoothly and perhaps with a little bit of less stress. The last resource is the Student Borrower Protection Center. They have a website called forgivemystudentdebt.org. And they've set it up so that you walk through steps similar to this presentation, to walk through those 4 steps of confirming your employer is eligible, verifying your loan types, consolidating if you need to, and then submitting the PSLF application. So you can visit them online at forgivemystudentdebt.org. All right. So thank you all so much. I know this is a lot to take in on any day of the week. So I appreciate you all jumping on today and staying through all of this. If you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to me. And also, I guess we can start to take some of those questions now.
Sure.
Yep.
And
Tisa, go ahead, Ian. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to thank Tisa for this presentation and all this great information she provided and shared with us. And I'll just turn it over to you, dear Roderick, for the questions now.
All right. I went off camera so you guys don't see me squinching my eyes trying to read the questions. But we have 20 questions queued up so far. And so I will start with question number 1.
Okay.
Do adjunct employees qualify, or do we need to be full-time employees?
So with adjunct work, it depends on how many hours you're working. I've been adjunct before and teaching 1 or 2 classes. I don't think that's going to meet the definition, even though I think I probably put in 30 hours a week most of the time. I don't think that will meet the definition of being full-time. If you have multiple adjunct positions and you combine those hours together to meet that full-time definition, I would encourage you to do that. But if you're adjunct and you have a low teaching load, then you might not make it to that 30-hour threshold.
Thank you. Next question, are they still keeping the guideline that the payments have to be done by month? Or hypothetically speaking, since it doesn't matter if you pay in full, could I make like 60 payments of $3 over a month, and those $3 payments will qualify as part of the 120 payments?
So unfortunately, they will not allow you to speed up the process. It's a minimum commitment of 120 months of that qualifying employment. and 120 months of repayment status history. So you can't make, if you make multiple payments in 1 month, they'll just lump it together and count it as 1 month.
Yeah. All right. If you work for 11 years,
Mhm.
But you recently lost employment, are you still eligible to apply if you're not currently working?
Absolutely. Under this waiver, that fifth and final requirement that you still have to be working for a qualifying employer at the time that you submit your application and receive forgiveness, that requirement is not being enforced. So apply through the waiver so that your application can be evaluated under that rule. So for anyone who's unemployed, retired, or just no longer working for a qualifying employer, still apply, because what they'll do is they'll look at your past repayment history. And if you've got 11 years where you had the qualifying employment and you have 11 years worth of that repayment history, then you could be one of those people who gets your debt forgiven as soon as your application is approved.
All right. Let's see. This is another adjunct. Adjuncts definitely work full-time, but at several colleges at once. Can we document teaching over the years, even though we might not teach there for a semester or two over the course of many years?
So this gets tricky because on the application, it has a start date and an end date. So if you started, let's say you're an adjunct for 1 semester, then you'd have an application that says you worked from, say, August to the end of December. And then if you came back 2 years later, you'd have another application for that different stint. So the paperwork can get to be tedious, but what I would encourage you to do is include it anyway for every one of those stints, because what you'll find is that maybe you have overlap from the different assignments at different schools where all of your part-time work put together meets that full-time threshold. So it gets a little tricky because you have to document those stints of employment, but I would want to maximize the amount of credit that I receive. So I say do it all, put it together, and then the Department of Education servicer will be the one to sort through the dates for overlap.
Okay. One question has already been answered. You have to be full-time to be eligible, or the definition of full-time by your employer. So I'll skip through that question.
Okay.
Does only full-time work for an eligible employer apply? Is there a way to receive credit for part-time work for a qualified employer?
So with part-time work, you can document it and submit that application so that it's on file, but those months would not count unless you had more than 1 part-time job and you put the 2 together to meet that full-time definition.
What if we consolidated years ago?
That's okay. If you consolidated years ago, I'd still encourage you to look at your loan types to see if you have a FFELP consolidation loan or a direct consolidation loan, because there's some people who consolidated years ago, but they still have a FFELP consolidation loan, and FFELP loans are not eligible for PSLF. So if you have a FFELP consolidation loan, you would have to consolidate again so that that FFELP consolidation loan becomes a direct consolidation loan. And once you apply, the servicer is going to look at the direct consolidation loan first, then they're going to go back and look at your FFELP consolidation loan, and they'll look at the FFELP loans that went into the FFELP consolidation loan, so that all of your repayment history after October 1st of 2007 is considered.
This may be redundant and I apologize. What if I still have more years to work in order to qualify? So I can't apply until after the limited waiver, but I have loans I need to consolidate. If I consolidate now, will my past repayments still be counted?
So if you consolidate now through the waiver, then your past history, your repayment history could be credited toward PSLF. If you have less than 120 months of repayment history and employment history, I still encourage you to apply now so that you can have your history evaluated under the more lenient rules. You don't just submit the application once you get to 120. That used to be the case, but I think last year, the Department of Education changed the application process. There used to be 1 application for forgiveness and another application to certify your employment. So you would wait until you got to 120 to submit the actual application. But now they've streamlined it so that the same form that was used to certify your employment is the same form that you would use once you get to 120 to actually apply for forgiveness. So ideally, If you've got less than 10 years right now, you submit your PSLF application before October 31st of 2022, and then you'll continue to submit that application every 12 months so that your employment is being tracked and your repayment history is being tracked. And then once you reach 120, you submit that form one more time so that you can have the remaining debt cleared.
How long do you have to be working for a qualified employer?
To actually get the full forgiveness, at least 120 months. But to gain credit, you could have started last week, and if you apply now, then this would count as your first month.
What if you have worked for several different organizations during the year since 2007,
Okay.
but none of them individually for 10 years or more? Think about it.
That's perfectly fine. Yep, your employment does not have to be with the same organization. Your employment doesn't even have to be consecutive, but you get to 120 faster if it's consecutive. So if you work for different employers, what you're going to do is go to the PSLF help tool and make sure that when you go there, you have the employer ID number for all of those employers. You're going to add each employer to the application. And when you download your PDF, there's going to be one page for each employer to verify. You want to send that page to them so they can sign it and give it back to you. And then you submit your application to the servicer. Quick note here, if you work for an organization that, let's say, is closed or no one there is willing to certify your employment, there's a box that you can check on the application that says, the organization is closed or I'm unable to find someone to verify my employment. So if there's no one around, it'll take a little bit of extra documentation, but you still have a chance.
When I first looked into this, the PSFL only covered one of the two types of consolidated direct loans. I believe they were income contingent or graduated repayment plans. Does the limited PSFL waiver do away with this requirement?
So the limited waiver will recognize months that your loan was in a repayment status. So whether you were paying on an income-driven plan or a graduated plan, that doesn't matter with the waiver. What they're looking at was your loan in repayment or deferments prior to 2013 count. Certain types of forbearances count as well. But the key is they're looking at the status of the loan, not the actual payments that were made. So your repayment plan doesn't matter. As for the loan types, direct consolidation loans qualify. If you have FELP loans and you consolidate them into the direct loan program, they would become eligible because they're now part of a direct consolidation loan. There are some loans that do not qualify, such as joint spousal consolidation loans. Those come up for some people who years ago had the option to combine their loans with their spouses. Unfortunately, those loans do not qualify for PSLF.
Can my federal direct plus and FEL loans be consolidated? If so,
yes, Nikki.
How do you do this?
Sure. So you can consolidate your loans by going to studentaid.gov. And when you log in, the main navigation bar has a tab that's called Manage Loans. And under the Manage Loans menu, you should see a Consolidate My Loans link. That will take you straight to the application. Once you get into the application, you'll see a list of all the loans that they have on file with check boxes next to them. And if you want to go ahead and consolidate all of those loans, you would just complete the application there.
Does a work study student qualify?
As an employee?
Yes.
So that's a really good question.
A work study student at MICA does not work 30 hours.
Okay, so yeah, if you don't meet the standard of an average of 30 hours per week and you don't have another part-time job to add on to the hours that you work for MICA, then no, it would not work.
Okay. How does COVID student loan relief factor into these 120 payments? Do
It
all
helps us.
months of release count towards the 120 if you've already been accepted into PSFL?
Yes, if you've already been accepted into the public service loan forgiveness pipeline and you've had the qualifying employment this whole time during the CARES Act forbearance, then those months, they have said those months will count. So this is going on a 2.5-year gift, basically.
Right. My loans were consolidated years ago. Is there a right and wrong consolidation? I've been teaching and paying for 22 years.
Okay. So this is where you need to go into studentaid.gov and drill down to look at your loan types. Because if you consolidated a long time ago, it's possible that your consolidation is still a FELP loan. So if your consolidation loan is a FELP consolidation loan, you would need to consolidate again so that that FFELP loan becomes a direct consolidation loan. If you consolidated a long time ago and the loan is already a direct consolidation loan, then you do not need to consolidate again. But if it's FFELP, you must consolidate if you want it to be considered for PSLF through the waiver.
If we qualify and we have now overpaid under the cover time, are they sending out rebates?
Some people do get refunds. I know someone who got, I think, $45,000 refund, but the refund only comes if you overpaid on a direct loan. So for instance, if you had a FFELP loan and you just consolidated that loan, let's say last month, if you made more than 120 payments on a FFELP loan, you would not get a refund. But if you had consolidated into the direct loan program, say 10 years ago, anything over the date where you would have been approved for PSLF, if you made any payments after that date, then those payments would be refunded. So there is a possibility you could get a refund, but it's only for overpayments that are made on direct loans.
Does my loan held by American Education Services qualify?
It depends. If you, AES, I think, is one of those services that dabbled in federal and private loans. But the way that I advise people to tell the difference is when you log into studentaid.gov, if you see the loan there, then it's a federal loan. And if you see that the loan type is a FFELP loan, you need to consolidate it. If you see the loan as a direct loan, then you don't need to consolidate it. But it depends on if you see it in studentaid.gov. That's how you'll know it's a federal loan that you could use to qualify for PSLF.
For clarification, can we submit an application for the waiver before it is over in October to get into the pipeline so that when we finish, we're considered within the waiver rules? Or do we need to wait until we have finished the 120 months of repayment under a qualified employer?
Do not wait. What I would do is, regardless of how many months of loan repayment and employment history you have, if you have 1 year, I would apply anyway, just to get in the pipeline so that you make sure you get credit for every possible month before this waiver expires. If you're a person, let's say you have 8 years, but maybe you were paying on the wrong repayment plan, or you needed to consolidate your loans, do that and then apply through the waiver before October 31st. The reason why I encourage people with less than 10 years to apply is because you can go from having 0 qualifying payments to 50 or 60 just because of this waiver, because the requirements around loan type and repayment plan and whether a payment was made in full or on time, those are not being considered right now. So if you want to get the maximum amount of credit for your past employment and repayment history, I'd say apply for the waiver. Definitely apply and make sure you do it before October 31st of 2022.
Is a Sallie Mae or Navient consolidation considered private?
Look in studentaid.gov because some people still have federal loans that are serviced by Navient. So look in studentaid.gov, and if you see the loan listed there with a balance, then that should be a loan that you can either consolidate if it's a FFELP loan, or if it's a direct loan, just go ahead and apply for PSLF.
Does an internship for a qualified employee count towards this program?
If you were an actual employee and the internship was with an organization that is a qualifying employer, I'd say apply anyway, because you work for the organization. Your job title doesn't matter. If you are a paid employee of the organization and the organization qualifies, then I say submit.
Does the adjunct qualification only count in class time, or does it go by credit?
I don't think it goes by credit. I think Congress is actually taking this up right now through an act. I can't remember the name of it, but it's something like simplifying and strengthening PSLF, and I think adjuncts are included in there. I don't think they'd go by credit hour because that's kind of hard. For me, that's just kind of hard to say, well, if you teach 3 credits, then we know you do 10 hours per week. I'm not sure what the standard is there, but I would still encourage you, if you're an adjunct at more than one institution at the same time, submit the applications anyway to see if you might be able to combine those adjunct positions to equate to one full-time position.
Is there a service or support out there to get one-on-one assistance? I tried filling it out myself and it said I didn't qualify. but I can't quite figure out what I did wrong. I've worked in qualifying employment since 2007.
Okay. So you can reach out to me. I have offered a lot of this help to many people. I do have to say that on the for-profit side, I have a business that does this, but my goal is to get this kind of service provided to borrowers for free through the Maryland Center for Collegiate Financial Wellness. So that's the mission that I'm on right now. But you can reach out to me. If it's simple, I can send you some answers, or we can get together on Zoom and walk through it together.
I was working at a qualifying employer as an independent contractor for over 30 hours a week. Would those years count?
Unfortunately, independent contract work does not count. You have to be a direct employee of the organization. So if you receive a 1099 instead of a W-2, then the employment would not count because you're considered an independent contractor and not a direct hire. There might be some exceptions, not necessarily for independent contractors, but if you work for an organization that, let's say, was small and they did not want to do payroll in-house and they paid an outside contractor to perform their payroll and tax document functions, then that's a case that you can argue because you're not working for the payroll company. You're actually working for the qualifying organization that just outsources payroll. And since they outsource payroll, your W-2 comes from the payroll company and not the actual qualifying employer. So if it's one of those situations, I would definitely apply using the employer's EIN. But if you were a strict 1099er or an independent contractor, unfortunately, that work does not qualify at this time.
Do you know how payments toward eligible student loans using the AmeriCorps Siegel Education Award might be affected by this waiver? I understand in the original PSLF, there were some specific requirements for the time frame of when a Siegel Award was applied in order for those payments to qualify.
Yes. So there are provisions. I don't want to quote you the wrong thing, but I from what I remember, it has to do with lump sum payments and how long those lump sum payments could be applied as qualifying months. So I need to go back. I can find you the exact language and I can share that with Ina to forward out to you all. But I do believe there is a provision for those types of lump sum payments because there were some people who put their loans into a forbearance, and forbearances for the most part do not count toward PSLF. So there were people in situations where they were doing qualifying work, but they weren't getting credit for it because their loans weren't in a repayment status.
What if a former qualifying employer no longer exists or cannot verify a signed form? Can you provide alternate verification?
That's okay. If the employer has closed or if there's no one that's willing to certify, then there's a box that you can check in the PSLF help tool. It will ask you, is the employer closed or could you not find anyone to certify? And if you check that box, they will let you know what alternative documentation you need to provide to prove that you work there. Usually it's W-2s that they ask for.
All right, we got about 5 more questions.
Okay.
All right. Hi, I work for a qualifying employer for 9+ years, and I will still be working there. I'm still in school, and I haven't started to repay my direct subsidized loan. Do I need to apply for PSLF before the deadline?
So if you've never been in repayment at all, then the PSLF application would not help you because your loans, well, let me step back. If your loans were never in a repayment status, then PSLF would not help because you have to have the months of employment and months of loans being in repayment. So what they're looking for is overlap. And I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding the question. If this is a person who, let's say, graduated in 2020 and then their loans went into that CARES Act forbearance, those months can count. So you would definitely want to submit the PSLF application. But if you've been in school the whole time, never had any repayment at all, then PSLF wouldn't help you right now because you have no repayment history to match the employment history. If you just started a qualifying job and your loans just went into repayment, I would submit the PSLF application, though, in that circumstance.
Would you consolidate through studentaid.gov or through your loan servicer?
Studentaid.gov.
I might have missed this. My apologies. If so, should we consolidate loans before or after checking eligibility or after applying for public service forgiveness?
So the first step I would do is to confirm your employer's eligibility, because if the employer is not eligible, or if none of your employers after October 1st, 2007 are eligible, then you wouldn't get any credit toward PSLF. The second thing is to verify those loan types. And if the employer is eligible and you look at the loan types and you have FELP loans, you need to consolidate. If you have direct loans, you don't need to. From there, you should, well, it seems to work most efficiently when a person consolidates first and then submits the PSLF application. Because if you have FELP loans, for instance, and you submit a PSLF application before you consolidate into the direct loan program, you're running the chance that once your PSLF application is reviewed, they're going to look at your FELP loans, and FELP loans don't qualify. So it works more smoothly if you have those older types of loans. You consolidate them first and then wait for the consolidation loan to be dispersed. And then once that consolidation loan has dispersed, then you submit your PSLF paperwork, because by the time the servicer uses your PSLF application to evaluate history, they'll see that you now have a direct loan and the direct loan qualifies. Like I said before, if you submit the PSLF application first and the only loans you have on file are FELP loans, then the application would be rejected because the loans that you have are not eligible. I know as we get closer to October 31st, people are not going to want to wait for the consolidation loan to be dispersed before they submit the application. And I completely understand that, because what's most important here is that you get all of the paperwork in by October 31st. But if you can consolidate first, wait a little bit, and then send in that PSLF application, because you don't want your application to get rejected because you have the wrong type of loans.
Do payments towards loans that you have paid off completely apply toward your 120 payments or additional loans you may have?
So they only look at loans with remaining balances.
All right. And let's see. That is all. So there's a few internal questions that are out there about who do we submit our forms to? And thank you, Ina, for answering those questions. But that is all the questions.
All right.
All right. Well, Tisa, thank you again for covering all these questions, and Roderick for helping out with the questions as well. Now we only